Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation for World Cultures on the Egypt unit. In this particular lesson, we're going to be looking at Egyptian mummification. In particular, we're going to be looking at the different steps as part of the process of Egyptian mummification and embalming, and also looking at the philosophical and religious reasons behind the mummification process as it was carried out by the Egyptians as well. Before I get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson on the correct Google Doc and to scroll down to the correct portion. Please remember to fill in any key content and or answer any key concept questions that appear throughout the doc and lesson. Once again, please remember that you can replay any part of this presentation that you may need for clarity later on. Here we go. Let's get started. Egyptian mummification. Consider this question. What happens after we die? Many of us today might know the scientific and physiological reasons and characteristics and phenomena that happen after we die, but what about the philosophical and religious reasons? They vary, probably based on your faith and belief. However, the Egyptians had a different way of looking at the mummification process and also the philosophical and religious reasons as to what happens to the spirit after their time on earth is over. To understand the story of all of us in regards to death and mummification, we must understand it from an Egyptian perspective. Let's go ahead and get started. Section 1. The process. The purpose of Egyptian mummification. The ancient Egyptians believed that after death their bodies would travel to another world during the day, and at night they would return to their bodies. That might be one of the main reasons as to why they placed such great emphasis and care on the deceased bodies. Please keep in mind that they went to great lengths to restore the body to a human-like characteristic. In order for the person's spirit to live forever, it had to be able to recognize and return to the body. If a spirit could not recognize the body it belonged to, it would die. This is why the Egyptians wanted to preserve the bodies of the dead in as a lifelike a state as possible. Mummification guaranteed, therefore, the eternal life for the eternal spirit. It should be noted here that Egyptians not only mummified and embalmed pharaohs, but they also did for other people too. Now, of course, the extent upon which the mummification process was carried out did vary based off of the person being worked on. The mummification process in full. The entire process took about 70 days to complete. You see, several embalmers conducted the task in the special embalming shop, or pernefer. The chief embalmer was known as the Ereshasta, and he wore a jackal mask to represent the god of Anubis, the god of mummification. It's very likely that you might have seen this drawing or picture before in some capacity. The Egyptians many times would dress up as gods and deities to help in the mummification process. After the body had been shaved and washed with wine and spices, all the parts that might decay were in fact removed. The embalmers first removed the brain through the nose using a long hook. As depicted here, you can imagine this hook was inserted through the nostrils. The next slide is going to explain how this entire process was carried out. The long hook was used to stir up the brain until it was actually liquefied. Then, the embalmers would turn the body face down to allow the brain to ooze out of the nostrils. The Egyptians were so rough on the brain because they didn't realize its importance. They thought its sole purpose was to produce snot. So in many ways, the Egyptians had their finger on the pulse in terms of correctly mummifying the human body and understanding organs, but when it came to the brain, they probably couldn't have been more off. Section 2. The rationale behind the mummification process and mythology. Next, they would remove the soft, moist body parts that would cause decay, and a deep incision or cut was made in the left side of the abdomen to remove the internal organs. The most important organs being removed were the lungs, the stomach, the liver, and the intestines. In some cases, they removed the heart, but in others they left it. Because it was considered to be the seat of the soul that testified on behalf of the deceased during the judgment before the gods. You might remember this iconic scene too from the lesson on the Book of the Dead. The weighing of the heart determines the justification of one's life based off of good deeds, actions, thoughts, and principles. If the heart were heavier than the feather, that could alter your journey in the afterlife and your judgment by the greater deities. The body was stuffed with bundles of strong drying salt called natron. As seen here by this diagram, natron was essentially able to go inside the incision and to give the body a structural human-like form. It was then completely covered with natron and placed on a slanted couch so that any fluids that dripped out as the body was drying could be collected and buried along with it. While the body was drying, the internal organs were also dried and preserved with natron. They were then wrapped in strips of linen and put into separate containers called canopic jars. You see, the Egyptians believed that all body parts would be magically reunited in the afterlife, and the body would become whole again, just like the god Osiris. Osiris, by the way, is known as the god of the afterlife. According to the Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Set and hacked into pieces. The goddess Isis reassembled the pieces, and Osiris was magically restored and went on to become the god of the afterlife. The stoppers on top of the canopic jars were shaped like the heads of the 4 sons of the god Horus. You see, each son protected the organ placed inside his respective jar. Dumanitef, who had the head of a jackal, guarded the jar that contained the stomach. Qubeneseth, who had the head of a falcon, watched over the intestines. Hapi, the baboon-headed son of Horus, protected the lungs, and while human-headed Imseti was in charge of protecting the liver. Now, it should be noted here that even though great lengths were gone to preserve the organs, they of course experienced decay over time as well. Canopic jars were usually stored in a chest that was later placed in the tomb with the mummy. The chest might have very well looked like this. And after 40 days, the body was completely dried. The skin became shrunken, wrinkled, and leathery. The bundles of natron were removed from the body cavity, and the mummy was cleaned one more time and rubbed with sacred oils to soften the skin. The mummy's head and body were packed with herbs, sawdust, and linen soaked in scented oil so that they could regain the shape that they had in life. Stones or small onions were placed under the eyelids to restore a lifelike appearance. Once this was done, the mummy could be covered with necklaces, rings, and bracelets made of gold and gems. If you remember from the previous lesson, by the way, jewelry was really an important prized possession for most of the pharaohs and royalty. In one Egyptian myth, the god Horus had his eyes miraculously restored after losing it in a battle with the evil god Set. The eye of Horus, called a wedget, is associated with healing and protection in Egypt. A wax or bronze plate with the wedget carved on it was placed over the embalming incision to magically heal the gash in the afterlife. The entire body was then covered in shrouds and bound with strips of linen until the mummy had returned to its original size, and this was a complicated job and could take as long as a week. As you can see here, this is a picture of the process. Can you imagine the number of layers required to bring the mummy back to its human-like form? Small magical amulets were inserted between the layers of bandages to further protect the mummy's spirit on its way into the afterlife. As each layer was added, it was coated with resin to hold the wrappings together with a waterproof seal. Depicted here are examples of what amulets very well could have looked like. Section 3. The final phases and the burial and beyond. So after the wrapping was finished, the head of the mummy was covered with a portrait mask just to make sure that the spirit would recognize it. As depicted here, I believe this is the mask of King Tut. The masked mummy was then placed in a series of gilded wooden coffins and put into a sarcophagus. As you can see here, our sarcophagus and coffins are depicted. On the day of the funeral, the mummy was brought to the tomb where priests performed the opening of the mouth ritual, touching the eyes, the nose, the mouth of the coffin with a sacred tool. This ritual reactivated these senses for the afterlife. Before the tomb was sealed, family members deposited food, clothes, furniture, and dishes, which the Egyptians believed the deceased would need for eternity. Scenes of offering bearers' daily life were painted on the walls of the tomb which provided comforting and familiar surroundings for the deceased in the afterlife as well. After the tombs were closed, some wealthy families hired priests to offer food for the soul of the deceased periodically. Family members visited the site during special holidays to conduct ceremonies for the deceased. The end. Or is it? As you're aware, looking at the process of Egyptian mummification gives us better insight into what these people believe. And in many ways, they had everything right. Many morticians today still use a lot of the procedures and a lot of the protocol of Egyptian embalmers that mummified some of the greatest pharaohs of our time. One humbling, sobering point to keep in mind, though, is that the process has changed so much. However, no matter what religion you are, or what faith you are, or if you believe in an afterlife or not, the process of death and the prospect of an afterlife are still compelling and give us insights onto any culture. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with the rest of the lesson.